Now, you know all of these guys. We'll throw it open to them. I'm going to ask the first question. Having read I was going through some of the AHB threads on hops before I spoke to Tim to work out what was people were asking. One of the constant questions in is do we freeze our hops? Do we fridge our hops?
You can freeze them, but you don't need to freeze them. If they're packaged in the foils like that, so we typically store them between 2 to 4 degrees, just a normal refrigerator.
Cool. Oh, sorry. You guys got microphones there as well. You see them.
Testing. I have it's Matt Chapman calling from Grafton. I have an easy question for you, Tim. I've never been to a commercial hops farm before. I'm just wondering, before its harvest, is there an aroma there?
Can you hear me now? Yeah, the question with regard to aroma, very much so. The hops, when they flower and the cones start to form, initially they're quite just green, grassy sort of aroma, and then as the lupulin glands fill, they're like a little balloon. Those little yellow lupulin glands, they're like a tiny balloon, and they start to fill. And as they're filling, that's the alpha acids and the essential oils building up. Interestingly, a lot of people make a lot of judgment calls on hops by rubbing and sniffing them, and that is important. And you find for a hop like Galaxy, for example, you can smell that passion fruit sort of character in the hop that actually translates into the beer. I guess just an extension of that is that if you're smelling and rubbing pellets or hop flowers, it is not necessarily what you're going to get in your beer. Some hops, you will get that character you smell in your beer, but often you will not. The way the hop presents in the beer will actually be different. I know that's a little bit more than what you actually asked, but I think that's an interesting point nonetheless.
Thank you.
Is that working? Yeah. I just wanted to comment, rather than put on a question, that you should always, this is to the yeast, John, that you should always taste your starter and smell it before you pitch it. You never know what might have gotten in there unintentionally. I don't know what your comment to that would be.
Yeah, if you smell your yeast starter especially, and you're getting a sour or vinegary smell, that's usually a sign of a contamination, usually bacterial, and that's where you may not want to pitch your yeast. But if you're doing a starter, and especially if you open the vial of liquid yeast, that yeast is so concentrated in that vial, you're going to get a whole range of different smells that may or may not actually mean anything. So testing your yeast by your nose is not something we normally recommend, just because those cells are so concentrated. They're going to give you a lot of smells. And also, especially with lager yeast, it produces a lot of sulfur just naturally during fermentation. And again, you may get a lot of sulfur on your nose and think that, the rotten egg smell, this yeast is off. Well, it's really not. That's a byproduct of natural, normal fermentation by lager yeast. So I wouldn't go by smell, except in the case, like I said, of vinegar or acetic acid or sourness. And that's definitely a sign of bacterial contamination.
Hello. Question for Luke. I actually asked Luke at the break. I thought other people might be interested. What is the best time of year, Luke, to propagate the hops using the vegetative cuttings method?
We're in the vegetative phase, before they start flowering, if you take cuttings in that flowering phase, the hop's actually going to be putting all the energy into flowering rather than growing. So you want to do it before they start flowering, and if you want to get a rhizome from that cutting for next year, you'd want to do it at least in December would be the latest time, but they'll still take anywhere up to March. Yeah.
This is a question for Tim. Tim, I really appreciated that DVD that you showed at the beginning. Is that available anywhere on the net, or is that just something that you guys carry around?
I haven't actually put it on the net because it's just such a big file size. I've just compressed it into, put it in a different file, and I've got them on USB sticks. It's about 125 meg though, so it's quite large. So I am hoping to get it up on our website. But if you want a copy of it today, I've got at least a few on USB sticks if someone wants it. I've got some on a DVD as well. There was one upstairs there someone can have if they want it.
I need help. My question, Earl Evans from the Brisbane Brewers. My question is to our expert on yeast. Over time I've tried a lot of things with yeast, including slants and slides and my own propagation, some with success and some not. On looking at the slides, I've noticed quite often I get a lot of very small yeast-shaped cells, and in amongst them I get about a 1 or 2% of very large round ones rimmed in black. Could you tell me what they are?
No. There's a chance it could be wild yeast that has gotten in there. You might have a wild yeast contamination. Especially if the morphology of the yeast is different. I assume you're looking through a microscope. It's really the only way to see yeast. But it could be something other than yeast. There's a lot of other things that could be in the slide. It could be a very small air bubble that is rimmed in black. I mean, it could be a lot of things. I actually don't work in the lab, so I don't deal with yeast on that level at all, ever. So, yeah, I don't know what that could have been.
Just one more question, perhaps. With the yeast, they nominate a range of temperatures as being the most suitable for fermentation. Do you think that it's worthwhile to deliberately test throughout that range to try and assess the variation in the level of fermentation byproducts such as esters and things like that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And a great example is the Hefeweizen 4 yeast that we have. It's supposed to give you a lot of clove and phenolic kind of flavors in the description. I brewed a beer with that this summer. Didn't really want the clove, but I wanted more of the fruity ester that it produces. And so I went above the recommended range, and it gave me a lot of those fruity esters and none of the clove that it says it's supposed to give you. So absolutely, use this poster and use these characteristics as guidelines. These are not rules. There are no rules in homebrewing. So do your experiments, brew the same beer with the same yeast, and try it at the low end of the range, the high end of the range, the middle. And that's really the only way you're going to get consistent results, is to be able to control these variables in your brewing. If you can brew and ferment at 68 degrees every single time, your beer should be pretty consistent. But if you decide, even with like the California ale, it's supposed to be very neutral, I'm going to try fermenting it at 85 degrees Fahrenheit, which is probably, 29, 30 degrees C, see what happens. And yeah, you're going to have a beer that gives you a headache, but because of all the fusel alcohols that are produced. But now you know that, and you know what this yeast does, and then maybe you try that with a different yeast. So absolutely, I encourage experimentation all the time. And then when you do that, share that with your club and share that with other clubs so that people can learn from your experience.
To answer my question, you also answered some of the reasons for my headaches. My final question to you, sir. With all the yeast they recommend, or they state a range of attenuation level, is this really reference to the mash temperatures and the sugar profile that they produce?
I think these ranges were developed in the lab through what we call mini fermentations or forced fermentations. And so this is just, again, it's a guideline, it's a range of observed fermentation values that they've done. I think they've done it with a fairly low, like a 10 Plato wort, which would be about 1040. Very fermentable wort. They use malt extract in the lab, so it's fairly fermentable. That's all. They don't actually make their own extract in the lab. They don't mash. They just buy malt extract in big tubs like you would get at a homebrew store. And that's what the lab does all their fermentations with. So you absolutely can affect that by your mash temperature. If you want to go and get a very, very fermentable mash, then yeah, you can ferment it, or you can mash it at different temperatures and make your wort much more fermentable, and then you'll get numbers over and above that.
Just another quick question for not Chris, actually. When you were talking about the starter, you mentioned that just put it on your bench at room temperature, which in Brisbane's roughly, depending on time of year, between 20 and 30 degrees centigrade. Is that appropriate? Is that an appropriate temperature range, I mean?
Yeah, it is. You want to keep your yeast starters, and 70 degrees Fahrenheit is what I'm used to saying, so like I said, it's probably around 21 degrees C. So just typical room temperature for both lager and ale yeast, because that strikes a good mix between activity level and fusel. You don't want your yeast to be too active in a starter, because that's not healthy for the yeast. It's really stressful if you're growing a starter or fermentation at, like I said, 85 degrees. It's going to be kicking out fusel alcohols, and it's going to be kicking out all kinds of stuff. That's pretty stressful on yeast. And the point of making a starter is not only to have yeast growth and increase the cell population, but yeast vitality, which is the health of the yeast. So the yeast you get from White Labs is pretty much, they're all Olympic athletes. They're all grown under high oxygen, high nutrient conditions, and each one of these yeast cells is ready to go. After it's been through a fermentation, some of these yeast cells are going to be tired and worn out and ready to just sit in their rocking chair and watch the sunset. Some of the new cells produced are going to be these Olympic athletes, and in a repitch situation, you have a whole range of cells. So when you're doing your starter, 70 degrees Fahrenheit or like say 21 centigrade is right about a good middle ground of fermentation activity and growth. And so that's kind of what we found to be the best temperature, both lager and ale strains. Because again, you don't really care about the flavor of that starter. You're going to decant off most of that wort anyway. You really just want that activity level.
The hops can handle a fair bit of heat. They actually, well, firstly with the light, the hops are very sensitive to day length, and that's why most of the hops in the world are grown between above 40 degrees of latitude. We're actually a little unusual with a property in Victoria that's about 37 degrees of latitude, 38 degrees of latitude, and that's actually inside the typical hop growing regions of the world, which is like 40 to 55. So it's that day length that they're particularly sensitive to. It was interesting, we were just chatting then, the work that's been done with the hop varieties that do grow further north. It was interesting to see Pride of Ringwood on the top of that list. That is one of the least sensitive to day. That's one of the varieties that is really not so sensitive to day length, and that's why we're seeing some success with that variety further north. I've actually just sent some to Burleigh as well, Burleigh Heads, Burleigh Brewing. They've just put some Pride of Ringwood in there. In terms of temperature, the hop plant being big, physically large plant with big leaves, if it gets too hot, the plant just shuts down. It's one of the reasons why we still run overhead irrigation up near Bright in northeastern Victoria, where it can get into the 30s. Where we'll actually run all the overhead irrigation to actually cool the crop down and actually create that bit of a microclimate. So the other comment about wind is very important. They don't like wind, so if you've got hot, windy conditions, it will burn the leaves straight off those plants. So I don't know.
No, that's fine. I don't think I'll start a crop in Rockhampton.
Sorry?
I won't start growing hops in Rockhampton because everything you've said is basically an anathema to them. The question about water for David, is it possible to get an economical kit to test not only the pH but also the mineral content of water?
The pH question. You can buy high-resolution pH papers. They're pretty cheap. That's the most economical way of doing it. Or you could, I think the decent pH meter is about $75. So you can get cheaper ones, yeah. But I guess if you've got the ability to take that into a proper laboratory and test it against a really good one and it works fine for you, that's great. Most people probably haven't got that.
I bought a Chinese pH meter. It was like $10 delivered or something like that. The head of one of the bigger agricultural consulting companies, because I left it at his son's place and he thought it was one of their good ones. So we took it over to Thailand and did all the trial work with it for a $15 million cash of a deal. And so when they finished and when he got back, they worked out that they'd taken the wrong one, so they did take it to the lab and tested it, and it was fine. So yeah, those $10 ones, they can work.
And the other part of the question was the water profiles. You can take samples to like the government chem lab and get them assayed. But yeah, there is some information available on the internet for you. I'm not sure in Rockhampton if it's available easily from the council or what. But you can certainly purchase a standard water analysis at a facility that'll do the testing for you. But we were thinking about perhaps doing that at our club level if we couldn't get the information from our water authorities. In the break, one of the gentlemen from the crowd walked up to me and said he was the water quality manager for SEQ Water. So we have a contact now, so yes. Might be able to get the Brisbane water stuff anyway, so we'll talk later about Rockhampton perhaps and we'll see if we can find something for you. But I've got at least one profile on one day that was tested from Rockhampton recently, so I can have a talk a bit later on.
All right, public ridicule.
While I've got the microphone, I had a question myself for the hop boys from both perspectives. With growing multiple hops and whatever, you want to do a harvest on the same sort of day, particularly with the commercial guys. I'm not sure about the home. Do you cut everything back on a certain point and then, or does everything just gets planted at the beginning and go the whole way through and it's just you harvest them on harvest day?
Well, firstly, they're perennial, so we don't. So they actually, they go dormant during the winter and then they grow. Sorry, I don't know if you probably already understand.
Yeah, I just asked the question because I wanted to get it out there for everybody because
Yeah, I mean, what we do is we grow. It's important on the farms like that. We can't harvest all of it in one day. I mean, you saw the shot there with all the hops tumbling down into the conditioning area. That, when it's full, holds about 30 tonnes of hops. That's a full day's pick in that facility. So we harvest probably around 600 tonnes there. So it's spread over, 4 weeks. It's important for us that we grow different varieties. We couldn't grow on that larger scale a single variety because we would have to start before the hop is mature and the hop would be falling off the bines by the time we finish. So by growing a selection of different varieties, our varieties like things like clusters, cascades, Willamettes rather, they mature quite early. And then all the aroma hops, we pick those first, and then we'll move into the higher alpha hops, into the super prides, which is the bulk. That's the big variety that goes into the bulk of the Lion and Cascade beers in Australia, Lion and CUB beers rather. And then we move into some of the other varieties like Galaxy and Stella, which are quite late. So we stagger the harvest based on the varieties and try and pick them all at their best.
I just drag the kettle to the hop vine and rip them off and throw them in as I do it.
So in the presentation you said before that you trained up 3 vines per string and presumably 3 strings, so about 9 is about the good number to get a good yield, that's the one. When I saw the people in the video stringing them all up, is that when do they cut the others, or they just let them on the ground? What happens?
Some people cut them off. What we tend to do is the actual number of days they grow for is really important. So we get all those early shoots come out of the ground in Victoria, for example, and then we'll run the slasher over them and slash them all off. And we'll probably do that 2 times before we actually put them onto the string, because we want to actually control the number of days they grow for something like the Topaz variety. We want to grow that, we know, 120 days. So we actually train those on certain weeks of the year each year.
Question getting back to yeast for John. You mentioned that sulfur is pretty natural and normal in lager fermentation. And I know that it certainly is present with, it can be triggered with bacteria and whatnot if the yeast is contaminated. But in a healthy fermentation, are there yeast strains that will produce sulfur that aren't lager? For instance, brewing wheat beer lately, I've noticed that towards the end of the fermentation, it's tasting pretty good. There's no sulfur in there, and then I'm starting to drop the temperature down, and the yeast seems to throw in a whole lot of sulfur, probably as a reaction to being stressed or something. Is there some way to avoid that, or is there particular yeast strains that are going to do that no matter what? Or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, outside of lager strains, there are a few ale strains that do normally produce sulfur during fermentation. And sulfur is very volatile, so as long as you just give it time in the fermenter, that sulfur will bubble off in a way and it'll not be present in your final beer. And in the description on the poster, it usually does say which strains are known for sulfur production. I think the 029 Kolsch strain is one of those that we know just does normally produce a lot of sulfur. And that's normal. But if you've got a strain that's not listed as a sulfur producer and you're getting a lot of sulfur, that's normally a sign of yeast stress. That can come from maybe underpitching or pitching a strain that has a low vitality, which is health. Again, if you've got a vial that's past its best before date and you decide to go ahead and pitch it anyway, there might not be enough live cells left in that vial without doing a starter to finish off that beer, and so you're asking a very small number of cells to do a very big job, and that's going to be very stressful on those remaining cells. And so they will kick out sulfur as a way of punishing you for treating them badly.
That's a good answer. I guess what I was meaning is that I'm not noticing any sulfur production during fermentation, and is dropping the temperature something that you could imagine is stressing the yeast out and going to create sulfur?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that yeast do not like is large temperature changes in a short amount of time. So one of the things professional breweries tend to do, and they like to do, is after fermentation is finished, they like to cold crash their tank, get all that yeast to fall out, and then harvest for their next batch. And what I always tell these guys is, you are stressing the heck out of this yeast and then harvesting and pitching. Harvest first, then cold crash it, let that yeast fall out, and discard that yeast because you've already harvested what you want. So during fermentation, after fermentation, any kind of large temperature swings is going to be really stressful on that yeast. It really likes to be at a pretty constant temperature. So if you cannot maintain the temperature on the chart that says it's the optimal temperature, figure out what temperature you can maintain and maintain it, and you'll get a better fermentation than swinging into and out of that optimal range.
Dale, up this way, mate. I recently had a nice beer that was labelled as organic, and I'm just wondering, what is organic beer? I presume it mostly relates to how the barley's grown, and if that's the case, we're going to see more and more of it. Do you guys offer organic malt?
Yeah, we do. I think 2 seasons ago now, Joe White had an organic pale malt, which was sensational. It was one of the better malts they've ever produced, I reckon. The next year, they didn't get a crop, so there was none, and that sort of left a few breweries a bit high and dry. It's just, here in Australia, we don't grow much organic barley, but we now import it. There's a lot that comes out of Europe, and there's a bit Brees do a fairly decent range of organic malt as well out of the US. So Yeah, the organic status is, you're right, it's mainly to do with the barley. I think the last time I looked into it, there was, I think 5% of your inputs could be not organic, not organically classified, and still you can still get the classification. So your yeast and your hops don't necessarily need to be organic, but I don't know if that's still the case. So yeah, but your barley is your main thing, and I think it's a good marketing tool, and I think it will happen. It'll really grow. There's a couple of people who are, producing some good volumes of organic beer now. So I think it is a segment that will increase definitely. Yeah.
I've got the mic still, staying on the question of organics. Question about the hops. For the New Zealand hop growing industry seems to be relatively pest and disease free, so they can grow without some of the things that are going to be bad for organic classification or whatever. Is that something that the hop products in Australia would pick up as well, or is that feasible?
Yeah, basically New Zealand and Australia and South Africa are all pretty much in the same situation, that we don't have any downy or powdery mildew or hop aphid in the southern hemisphere, and that means that the hops that we produce here in Australia or in New Zealand can be grown without concern for those things. And when you're in the northern hemisphere, when they get outbreaks of mildew, which are very regular, they have to spray them with a lot of fungicide to keep that under control. I think your question was probably more so along the organic line.
Yeah.
New Zealand, they do produce some organic hops, we do not. We're lucky that we run very soft chemistry compared to the rest of the world, but as with the barley, that where they tried growing it organically and get no crop, we have grown certified organic hops in Tasmania. It was before my time with the company, and the results were so bad that they ditched it. We just had so much trouble producing any saleable quantity. Having said which, there is a really strong interest in it again now, and I've been approached quite regularly to see if we would have another look at that and see how we go. The methods we use for growing hops are very different these days, and we're taking a look to see if we can do that. So
cool.
Hopefully that answers your question.
It actually just answered mine as well. Thank you.
I've got a question for our yeast expert. How long can yeast remain dormant if I'm keeping the trub and storing it in the fridge?
Usually we say between 2 and 4 weeks after fermentation, as long as you're storing it under beer. That gives the yeast a little bit of sugars to use when it comes out of dormancy. Maybe even giving it some fresh wort from DME is probably a good thing, because as that yeast goes to sleep, there still are some metabolic processes going on inside that yeast cell. Even though they are very slow, it's not really a true dormancy. It's like a bear hibernating. The bear is still using the fat that it's stored up over the winter, but by the time that bear comes out of the cave, it's pretty skinny and it's going to be pretty hungry. Yeast is the same way. Once it comes out of dormancy, it's going to be pretty hungry and it's going to be looking for things to eat. So we don't recommend you store yeast with something like distilled water, because there's nothing in there for that yeast to eat as it comes out of dormancy. So after a fermentation, we say really 2 to 4 weeks is kind of the outside. If it's stored properly, if it's harvested properly, and if it has something to eat when it wakes up, that's usually a good time frame. After that, you probably don't want to use it.
Thanks.
The question was, how do our vials have a 4-month use by then? Remember that the yeast that we put into our vials is grown under laboratory conditions with a lot of nutrients, a lot of oxygen, and these cells have a very high vitality going in. When you're storing repitched yeast, again, you have this whole range of cells between the ones that are just born, ready to go, and the ones that have maybe budded 8, 9, 10 times, and they're really at the end of their life. So you've got this whole range of yeast. Plus, this yeast has been through a fermentation, which can be stressful on yeast. Even low-gravity fermentations do tend to stress yeast a little bit. So that's why this yeast, you want to try to repitch it as quick as you can. Yeast from the lab has never been through a fermentation. It's been grown under laboratory conditions, sterile conditions. So it is able to sit in this vial refrigerated for up to 4 months.
Just got a question for Wade. How are you going getting your beer out into market in, say, Brisbane and Queensland compared to interstate?
I'm really just focusing on the local areas, like just to get that market going. And is this on? Is that on? Yep. Yeah, I'm just focusing on the local area for now, and I think the market's growing, and I'm only a small producer, so yeah, in time, there might be opportunities to go interstate, but I think it's easier to keep it local and keep it fresh and not have to go through the logistics and things. But in the future, hopefully, there'll be opportunities to go interstate.
Are you finding it easy to get bars that'll take your product, or is it?
No, not really.
So it's a bit of that tap contract.
Yeah, there's contracts, there's so many, pricing, there's so many issues. But in saying that, it is getting easier, and people are trying different beers, looking for different beers. More bars are opening, looking for that point of difference. So, it is positive, even though it is tough.
Just make sure you come back after lunch, and Wade will actually do a presentation on being a contract brewer. So, last question, and then we might wrap up.
I've dabbled in hop growing myself over the years, and one of my particular plants I have grew for about 6 years, taking multiple cuttings, cutting ribosomes, all that sort of thing. So I ended up with like 10, 15 different plants. And then after taking all those cuttings, it finally grew to the point where I thought it was just about to come into flower, and then I found out the bloody thing's got balls on it and it's a male plant. Is it possible that it changed sex? I mean, you were talking there for a while that you could put hormones on and change the sex of the plant?
Nah, it's if it's male, it's it's all over.
So I got ripped off.
But with the hormone, what I was talking about is using a female that I know the variety of it, such as, I actually want to do it with Cascade because it doesn't grow very well where I live. So I want to get 2 plants, change one of the females into a male, and then breed them together, and then get those seeds, and then plant all those seeds, and see if any of those seeds that come up retain the Cascade characteristics, and also whether they'll actually grow where I'm growing the hops. But yeah, if you're starting with males, just buy another rhizome, because there's nothing you can do to change it over